Welcome back, and thank you for staying with us. And we are just continuing the conversation we are having this morning, talking about the ongoing Africa Summit, Climate Summit right here in Nairobi, just focusing on some of the issues that we need to focus on to address a global crisis that I think Africa has borne the biggest brunt if you look at the impact of climate change. And this is why heads of states and delegates from across the continent are meeting just to discuss how to solve this particular problem. And in studio, I'm hosting a panel of two and also virtually one, just to help us unpack this. I'm having in studio Joyce Kabui, the Africa Manager, Green Hydrogen Organization, Philip Kilonzo, the Head Policy, Advocacy and Communication at PACJA, and of course also virtually Dr. James Murombenzi. He's the Chief of Section at Africa Climate Policy Center. And before we went to the break, I just wanted to also just pick up your thoughts. Earlier when we were starting this conversation, Kilonzo, you have a feeling that we are veering off from how we're supposed to be tapping the opportunity that this summit is giving us as a continent. We're in day 3, still a few hours. I don't know whether anything can change, but let's stay optimistic. I just want you to tell us more about how you feel this should have been approached for us to really fully utilize this opportunity that doesn't come to us every day. This is a crisis that has affected us. Millions of people were starved in this continent because of the prolonged drought. We've lost livestock worth millions of shillings. We are still bearing the brunt of the impact of climate change, and it is not seeming like it's going away anytime soon. How do we take advantage of what is happening in Nairobi today?
Thank you. I think the first thing that we need to look at is whether Africa has ever had a dialogue with itself on matters climate change. Because the African Climate Summit, first and foremost, need to provide an opportunity for Africa to have a dialogue with itself and begin to see what is their priority, what is their key agenda, and how do they engage the global north and other players, informed from their own perspective. That is what needs to happen on the onset, and such that when then they move to the next level, then be it investment, then the conversations around placing at the center the African investor becomes quite important. The private sector in Africa are beginning to control the economy, so that again the economy is actually grounded within the context of Africa becomes an imperative. But Dr. Murombenzi actually spoke about the core issue. And the core issue seems, up to this particular point, not to have been galvanized in a substantive manner within the conference. Adaptation and adaptation. IPCC Act 6 report is quite clear that Africa will be impacted under all mitigation scenarios. So adaptation becomes then the priority number 1 for the continent. And therefore, this conference ought to have centered the adaptation imperatives. And the moment you begin to then center the adaptation imperatives, then you begin to see what needs to happen at the global level. At the global level, then you need to look at what kind of funding mechanism would be ideal. And when you start speaking about investments, then what kind of investment frameworks would be quite suitable for such a context. You begin looking at how do you move from private-led, private kind of window of investment into a public window. Right now, as it is, there is a moment that is being missed, because the global north is actually running away from the spirit of the Paris Agreement, where they were actually supposed to put money on table. They are blaming their inability to meet their targets to failure of the private sector in the north to contribute, which is not the case. Paris Agreement was not necessarily about the private sector in the north making a contribution. So essentially what they are saying is that let's use climate catastrophe. Let's use the opportunity presented by the masses who are suffering within the African continent to extend our business empire, which then defeats the essence of creating an equitable society and the spirit of the Sustainable Development Goals. So you begin to see so many things falling through the cracks. And when you look at then cushioning communities who are facing vagaries of climate change, you can't cushion them with loans. You can't cushion them with private investment. Grant-based mechanisms has worked throughout. Let's do an introspection. Let's look at continents that are affected by also drought. Let me settle first on drought as a manifestation of climate impact, and pick on a continent such as a region such as Brazil, a region such as Australia. You will realize that government did the bigger part of heavy lifting in terms of providing grants for investing in water infrastructure. And we don't hear the droughts in Brazil, even when Brazil has a drier part.
So it was an internal initiative within the country? It's
internal initiative, but African countries do not have that capacity. That capacity has been significantly eroded as a result of climate change, debt, COVID crisis, among other elements. Including neocolonialism-oriented type of programs. So it's time to then begin to look at how do you reorient our engagement within the climate discourse so that this then takes center stage and we are able, in a very collective manner, to hold the North to account for their actions. Thanks.
All right. He's saying investment is important, but that may have come later. What is pressing right now is adaptation and conversations around.
Can I add one thing which is extremely important? There is a serious cry by the African private sector players, serious cry even within the conference, that their discourse are not on board. Their consideration in terms of them beginning to center and lead even the investment conversations is not on board. So that cry is quite loud in terms of spaces, priorities, and what even the organizers think that constitutes innovative investments from the African private sectors players. So these are quite a number of issues that need to be placed within the context of the conference. Thanks.
All right. I don't know what you feel, Joyce, though, about the level of the discussions around investments taking place. And something that happened yesterday, Kenya actually signed a deal worth 1.9 billion shillings for green hydrogen. It's a pact between the European Union and our country that will see the country benefit from grants for investment in Kenya's green hydrogen industry. I don't know how you receive this news and what also you feel about the discussions and the commitments and the pledges. We saw so much about the pledges that were given yesterday with regards to actions in terms of climate change mitigation. How do you receive this?
I would love to first respond and react to what Philip said about adaptation and grants using public money instead of private. And I feel like this conference or this summit has been about both. Appreciating that there are people suffering droughts, we are losing our economies to floods and droughts, and that needs to be addressed urgently, no doubt. At the same time, we need to build our economies. And how are we going to do that? Whether it's public-private partnerships, whether it's private-private, but there has to be a commercial aspect. So it's not one or the other, and I believe it absolutely has to be both if you're going to really transform our economies as Africa. And this then brings in the aspect of industries, which will create millions and millions of jobs. Looking at green hydrogen, so in Africa, we have the Africa Green Hydrogen Alliance, which was 6 founding members. We have Egypt, Kenya, Mauritania, Morocco, Namibia, South Africa, and recently, as of yesterday, Angola and Ethiopia joined the alliance. And this is really just about realizing that potential of green hydrogen. And what will green hydrogen be doing really to our industries and to our economies? First, you've been hearing the conversation about tripling our renewables. So the capacity that we have, even as Africa, it's one of the assets that we have to put on the table and say, this is what we have. We can increase our solar, our wind, our hydro, and geo. And so this, once we generate this capacity, someone will need to offtake that capacity. And this is where the industry comes. And it's always sort of like a chicken and egg thing. So do we increase our generation capacity so that we can get in the offtakers, so the industries to set up those special economic zones and create jobs and, stimulate the economies. And so green hydrogen already comes as one of the offtake for the extra capacity. We've been hearing the Kenyan president talking about 100 gigawatts by 2040 from the current 3 gigawatts grid. That's massive. That's going to be huge. And someone has to buy this power and create this economy, and it has to be industries. And that's where really green hydrogen come in. And I really applaud Kenya for the partnership with the EU that was launched yesterday. And Kenya was also launching its green hydrogen roadmap, which again will really just shape where, at least appreciating where are the jobs, where are the socioeconomic benefits. Because when you look at where the projects are positioned, so there's Olkaria already, where we are planning, there's a plan to have a green fertilizer plant. And then you'll see some of these other projects will be coming up around the coastal area. So this is seawater. There's an added advantage. We already know that Kenya, we have a water challenge. So the aspects of some of the developers actually bringing in desalination to use this water for the production of green hydrogen. And what that means, then communities will also have access to clean water. And there's also then the aspect of increasing productive use of energy. Because right now, even when we say about 75% of Kenyans are electrified, we really have to unpack what that means. There's someone who just has a bulb and can charge their phone. But can they really get a fridge? Can they start a business with that? Do they have street lights that you can do your business up to 10 p.m.? So we have to take it to the next level that we're saying, yes, it's good. We're approaching the 100% electrification, but really what's the use of this power? Because it has to really go to commercial use. It needs to build businesses and stimulate economies. And this has been one of the greatest outcomes of this summit, and appreciating that's one of the biggest things that we can do. And we are ready to
That's the potential that we have.
Yes.
And that is just one example. If I'm just to come to you, Dr. Murobenzi, one example of some of the things that can be done within the continent to sort of solve this particular problem. But to effectively address the impact of climate change, I feel African scientists, researchers and innovators need to be supported. How do we go about this? And are there opportunities or initiatives that they can take advantage of? Because this is actually the time for us to be able to hear some of those things that are out there for people to take advantage of. Do you have a feeling or are there things that we can actually begin taking advantage of in terms of supporting our very own to come up with home-based solutions for the problems that we are facing as a continent?
Indeed, let me pick up from where the last panelist left.
Yeah.
The main challenge for the African continent is industrialization, because if you are going to develop the economies of this continent, you need to develop those economies on the basis of a sustainable industrial base. In order to do that, you need to invest in energy, massive energy. Africa still has 600 million people who have no access to electricity. You need energy to industrialize. You need to develop our steel industries. We need to develop our agriculture systems and so on. And in there are real opportunities for African scientists to get engaged in operationalizing these processes of development. But secondly also, and this is one of the main challenges for adaptation on the continent, is that without strong economies, it is impossible for the African continent to adapt to the impacts of already occurring climate change. And therefore, we need a lot of infrastructure development in order to make it possible and feasible for the continent to adapt to climate impacts. And again, there are opportunities there for our climate scientists, our industrial scientists, and so on to invest or to get to apply the different solutions that have been brought up. Most significantly, however, because the challenge is finance, and this is why this summit is structured around climate finance. Significantly, the continent is actually coming up with many innovative solutions on how we can finance the continent's industrialization, how we can finance the continent's climate response. One of the main things that is happening is how can the continent actually receive sustainable financing? How can our budgets be supported in a way that does not increase the debt burden that is facing this continent, but also in a way that is responsive to the priorities of climate change and development? And so this conference is coming up with solutions around, for instance, how we can use debt for nature swaps, reduce our debt burden, but also increase our investments in conservation, sustainable use of natural resources. The conference is coming up with solutions about how we can structure carbon markets as a source of an innovative source of finance for different climate actions. How the continent can actually design other financial solutions, very complicated financial solutions, but which can contribute to the availability of affordable and sustainable finance. None of this is a simple solution. These are complicated solutions, but they require the engagement of African experts, African scientists, in order to ensure that these solutions are designed in ways that are not implemented to the continent, as well as in ways that contribute to the sustainable development priorities of the continent. And finally, we also need to now start contributing towards the structuring of the loss and damage facility, which was launched at COP27, because the continent will continue to incur significant losses from climate impacts, and therefore there also needs to be mechanisms we need to design mechanisms to compensate for the losses that are going to happen from climate impact. And it is important that the voice of the continent be heard and get clear at the table in terms of how that facility is going to function, how it is going to be structured, who is going to receive how much assessment is going to be undertaken of loss and damages and so on. So very important contributions are being made and can be made by African experts in this whole process.
All right, thank you for that. And just coming to you, Kilonzo, for all these solutions to be cemented and for us to actually see real benefit, we'll also have to look at the other side, which is the policies and the legal frameworks that also guide this particular, space. Do you think we are good there, or there's still a gap in terms of policy and the legal framework?
Thank you for your question. I think I'll take it quite positively. Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance convened a dialogue with parliamentarians across Africa in Midrand around the month of May. And that becomes quite a useful reference point. And we furthered that particular dialogue in a meeting that we had here in Nairobi from 31st and 1st of September. With aim of, again, looking at our own landscape. The first thing that I'll say is that out of all the African countries, only 4 have very specific climate change laws. And when you have only 4 countries with specific climate change laws, then you have a bit of difficulties. In other countries, we are not saying necessarily that they are lacking elements of legislation that can serve the purpose, but they are scattered across a number of other laws. And therefore, there is need first and foremost to see then how do we then aggregate that particular effort. Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance, working with the Pan-African Parliament, we've initiated a process of developing a model law that can actually guide other African countries, and particularly fragile and weak states that might not be up to pace on that particular process to then formulate the law. But we must also then put in perspective, even as we do this, what would be the potential implications of 4 solutions on Africa's legislation, because there are quite a number of 4 solutions within the climate discourse that are also being proposed, which could have potential ramification on how the law is formulated and the participation of citizens in this particular process. There are other border issues, what I can actually describe as border issues. They are actually taking center stage. The carbon markets and the carbon conversation and whether it pays for Africa is a fundamental issues to look into in terms of, if today I pay you to sequester my carbon, then I'll have to do a bit of introspection of then who owns the forest that has actually sequestered the carbon. And right now as we speak, we have a legal case that entails United Arab Emirates and Liberia on issues of who owns a forest after a period of investments within that particular forest. So beginning to demonstrate that there is indeed real potential for some of the solutions that are being proposed also to have far-reaching ramification on the legal architecture of the continent. We've been having deep conversation with the pastoralists, the indigenous community of this particular continent, as part of the wider group that Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance is supporting in terms of organizing. And there are inherent fears in terms of whether some certain investments could then have deeper implications on their security of tenure in terms of land rights, rights to forest, rights to access forest and its resources and all that.
How do you sell this narrative in a language that is relatable to them, especially the local communities? Because this is what they would say, this has been our home, this is our space. How do you introduce laws to start telling us how to use what has been ours, what belongs to our ancestors? How do you tell this narrative in a way that they begin to understand and they begin to appreciate?
Thank you for raising this. I think I want to go back to a conference that we closed yesterday, which was a national conference on locally led climate action. And that is quite telling in itself in terms of how the law should even originate and the level of participation of local communities to the process. But as it is, then the imperatives of investments, particularly carbon markets, are actually dictating the architecture of the laws in quite a number of countries in Africa, not only in Kenya, but in other countries, and how that law should look like. That in essence means unless there is inherent participation of local communities, then some certain things might be lost. And equally within the same, then it means some certain elements of the law might be weakened in that particular regard in terms of ownership. But I think what is fundamental, even as we talk about some certain solutions such as carbon markets and how they play, we need to go back and ask how much investments comes up front. That's the first thing. Mm-hmm. Who eventually owns the carbon? And what is the implication of that carbon in terms of even Kenya meeting part of its bargain in delivering its nationally determined contribution? A brother of mine actually aptly put it that in a very interesting manner. He said the carbon market is like getting into a marriage, siring children, and donating them out. To
the analogy, though.
That's quite an interesting one. Huh?
Yeah.
Then at the end of the day, you are still expected to have your own children, which is quite interesting.
And
because you are supposed to demonstrate to the world that you are meeting part of your contribution under, in terms of cutting on emission under the Paris Agreement. But in this situation, under carbon markets, you are cutting and offsetting for other people. So there are things that need to be looked at in much more broader architecture, but also nuanced local context of communities and what it means in practice.
Yeah. Let's come back to you, Joyce. There is also this conversation revolving around how to make, this economically viable. I'm looking at how this green transition, ought to be making commercial sense, because for you to encourage the communities to be part and parcel of this journey, you also have to give them a way of, going about it. I've seen conversations around now green jobs, the green growth. Let's move in this direction. Explain to us in simple terms the commercial sense behind this green transition and what the future looks like if it is fully adopted.
It would be good for us to start from how this narrative about all the industrialized countries have used fossil fuels to get there, and no one has done it using renewables. Exactly that, no one has done it. So why can't we do it? Because it's there. The technology is ready. It's maturing. It's getting cheaper. And we are seeing more people take, if you're constructing a house and you're using solar panels or using a hybrid model, at your own house, you've built your own upcountry home and you've decided, I'm not going the Kenya Power way, but I want to solarize my house. Mm-hmm. And we're catching on this conversation. And the messaging has to be, there are options. At the time when these countries were industrializing with fossil fuels, as we know with innovation and R&D and how this thing goes, no one had discovered that we could do this using solar. But now numbers have been run that you can actually create jobs using this green growth agenda. So looking at that, I know for sure we'll have to make the price make sense for consumers, because if then when you look at also policies and frameworks such as CBAM in the EU side and IRA on the American side, we have to also look at the incentives. So in Kenya, we already have zero-rated solar panels. So if you want to do renewable energy projects, at least you're already saving on that capital cost. And this is just also one of the other things we need to be then encouraging the government to do. What are some of these incentives that you can really give the private sector so that then they can make these projects viable? The e-mobility is enjoying quite a bit of benefits. I hope that is, I'm sure we're going to see more EVs come up in the market. And I don't know if you got a chance to see the parade that was there on Sunday for electric vehicles. It's coming up. We have EV buses in the country. So it's making sense. And you see that even these EV buses are charging the same as the ones using the fossil combustion engine. So it's conversations, and we really appreciate the role that an organization like PACJA does, because they have this grassroots communication with stakeholders and partners, and then we make sense out of these projects. So that, again, also comes out about local content. So where are communities in all these projects, and where are we involved? And one thing we can say about green hydrogen that we really are doing as the Green Hydrogen Organization is we have good green hydrogen contracting mechanisms. And one of the most important ones is then ensuring that we are getting it right from from the very start and not making the mistakes that, for instance, oil and gas companies made when they were developing projects. So starting right from the start, and that's the opportunity we have with the Green Growth Agenda, Climate Positive. So it's really starting it right, starting with everybody on board, and really just making sure that the prices are then at a place where it makes sense for commercial uptake of these opportunities.
Starting is always good. Sustainability is also another, phase that we also need to focus on going forward. But I'll come back to that later. Let me just also get your points, Dr. Murabenzi, on this. I mean, there is that desire to, take this journey and take advantage of the green transition. But people are concerned about the level of investment that will be needed. How heavy or otherwise is it? And how is it compared to the value that we expect out of it as a continent?
Let me go back first to the question that you raised regarding policies and legislation that are required. Firstly, we have, as a continent, we have an African Union climate change and resilient development strategy, which is a 10-year strategy that was designed by the African Union as a framework to guide countries to develop their climate change solutions and their climate change policies and legislation. This started in 2022, and we have until 2032 to actually assist countries to develop appropriate laws and legislation to guide their climate response. Secondly, we are now in a process where we are assisting countries to translate climate policies into low emissions development strategies, because we have to insist that the continent's priority is development, but that development does not necessarily have to add to the emissions and to worsen the climate challenge. So we are assisting countries to see how they can develop low emissions development strategy, which address all of these questions about how is the climate support, how is the climate action going to be supported, how is climate change going to be addressed in terms of adaptation, in terms of mitigation, but also how are we going to engage with the mechanism in order to ensure that we have sustainability in all of the different strategic areas of climate change. So these include addressing the vulnerabilities of climate-sensitive sectors like the transport, the energy, the water, the agriculture. How do we ensure that we maintain employment in agriculture? For instance, most of our economies are dependent on agriculture. This is one of the most vulnerable sectors to climate impacts. But this is where you can also develop solutions around developing new forms of energy to drive agricultural activities, irrigation, and so on, in order to make it more efficient and more resilient as well. But also looking at, for instance, the Horn of Africa, we have these cycles of droughts, floods, and so on. How do you increase your ability to forecast the weather system and put in place early warning systems that are going to make it possible for planning, but also for responding to climate impacts as well. So there are many things that can be done. There are many things that are being done in order to address the question of the sustainability of the different climate responses themselves.
All right.
Now we have to recognize that the country is different. So there will be very locally specific solutions. There will be very locally specific actions, but we still need to have a continental framework to assist the elaboration of those local solutions.
All right. All right. I appreciate your thoughts on the, local solutions. But Philip, there's always this feeling and fear that probably we don't have the expertise, we don't have the right technology. Do you think we have that capacity as a continent? I'll go back to that question again.
Thanks. I think
that we always have to import technology, import expertise. As a continent, do you think we can actually get to a point where we begin to appreciate the fact that we can have capacity to do that?
I think we need first to do a bit of reflection and look at the lost space. I think Kenya used to manufacture solar panels for the whole of East African region. Where we threw, that was being done in Naivasha. Where we threw that away, I can't tell. But it's something that we have to keep pondering on in terms of where we lost it. And I was actually following through conversation and a presentation that was being made in SB 56 at Bonn by the United States on adaptation and the programs that they are implementing. It's not rocket science. It is actually what essentially has been implemented in Kenya since 2003, 2005 in terms of building resilience of communities that are at front line of climate crisis. So it's essentially the question of then whether the resources that are needed most by those communities are the front line. The climate funding that is needed by those communities are connecting with their aspirations. Yesterday in our conference that we were undertaking in collaboration with FLOCA, that is the Treasury, World Bank, the Council of Governors, and other CSOs. One of the things that emerged strongly, especially from the counties, is that each of the county has actually a flagship program that actually connects with the aspirations and the ideals of that particular locality in terms of how to then strengthen local capacities. Indeed, presentation centered around how do you connect farmers within decentralized, farmer-owned, farmer-controlled energy systems so that they are able to cut on the amount of bills that they are paying on power. How much how much investment is needed in water sector and the solarization process to enable communities build resilience and be able to produce, as well as also supporting some certain agro-forest related programs, which again overall enhance resilience, build the local economies and all that. I think the fallacy of technology coming from outside is also meant to then sustain the center-periphery exploitation. And unless we are able then within this particular conference to say this is how we will approach the technology element, this is a much that we need to transfer in terms of technology. This is how we will build our African capacity of African institutions in terms of research so that they are able to lead the process. Then we will have lost it. And that's why I kept saying Africa needed to have a dialogue with itself so that we are able, even within Africa, to map regions and zones as hubs of technology, and where we are able to see then how do we mobilize resources to scale as African nations, so that again we enjoy the multiplier effect of dominating the economy as opposed to exporting the economy outside. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's something that, you know, without a doubt, the continent is very rich in terms of potential and even the opportunities that it can tap to address this crisis. And I'll come back to the issue I raised earlier, Joyce. We're always good at starting. The journey, how we start, is colorful and very encouraging. We've seen very many projects, beautiful projects that had big promises about, you know, solving some of the issues that we are facing when it comes to climate change. But sustaining them, you ask yourself, what has been the impact? Years down the line, these flagship projects, some of them are just dead within the counties, within the villages. Villagers will be mobilized to begin doing small projects here and there. But then you walk there 3 years later, nothing is happening. I mean, what is the problem? What is the missing link? How do we sustain this conversation and the fire that usually burns when we start these projects?
It is a very interesting question because it's really one of the major problems with development, really. Because how communities, when we are building these projects, when we are designing them, when we sit in a room and say it would be fantastic to have Kipeto Wind Farm or Lake Turkana, and these are the numbers, this is the energy it will bring to the grid. Are communities on that table? Who is really sitting around this table when these decisions are made? And that could be a good starting point, because I feel like we already know what is needed to make these solutions sustainable, which again, partnerships is a major element of that, on top of the financing, because you have to really figure out where the financing is coming from, because again, we can't rely on the old systems of financing. But going back to partnerships, it's really then bringing the government, the private sector, the communities, the civil society onto this table. Again, also even the media, because we are all bringing in, we have to ask ourselves questions like Philip is saying, we really must reflect on what's the value of these projects. And from my background in development sector, one of the mistakes we're making is you'd come and you drill a borehole and do everything for the communities, such that even when it breaks down, they're not taking the initiative to fix this borehole because they were not involved in the construction, in the design, in just understanding the value. And that's one of the things that we can really change, or at least be more intentional about when we're doing projects. And there are lots of civil society organizations that are committed to supporting these processes while you're doing community engagement. And again, money, we need sustainable money, and I still feel that private sector resources is what will really take us where we want to be. So all these numbers that we're talking about, the renewables or carbon markets, regenerative agriculture, it will be private sector money. So the DFIs will come in, they'll give the capital for us to do the studies, to make sure the projects are viable, the numbers are right, and then it's really going to be that private capital, and we must start appreciating that and making the environment suitable for them. From where I sit also on the renewable space, I just feel a bit of disconnect from what His Excellency President Ruto is saying and what is actually happening on the ground. When you look at, for instance, the PPP projects that are stuck somewhere in the pipeline, but His Excellency is so committed to the 100 gigawatts by 2040. We must, it's a sprint. We have to move faster than we are if you're going to realize this. So again, it's us working together and appreciating that the ministries, so trade needs to be talking to energy, to treasury, a lot more than I feel they do. I definitely know that they speak, but are they really supporting private sector to deliver these projects together? Because the energy element, whether it's transport, it heavily then will rely on other. And we really must connect this as we're developing projects.
You know, you're talking about something that Philip also mentioned earlier, the exclusivity, that lack of inclusion of the private sector. And I just want to take you back there, just to talk a bit more about it. If you diagnose the problem, what are you seeing? What's the basic link, and how bad is it with this lack of collaboration and lack of goodwill in terms of just working as a team? What are we looking at if something is not done to fix that?
I think let's first get facts right. I think Africa is one of the regions where there are highest power tariffs across the world. The implication of that is that Africa cannot industrialize to scale. When you do a quick dissection of then who is controlling the energy sector within Africa, then you realize there is quite a number of foreign stakeholding. And that then begins to define the conspiracy in terms of unleashing the potential within the African sector. I think there has been no serious appreciation of where the African sector plugs in terms of scaling out and scaling up, and also mobilizing resources to scale. I like looking at taxation first and foremost and say, if government is taxing people, then there is a mechanism through which, and this money is available, it's taxing people and this money is available, then there should be mechanisms within which indeed it is possible to organize, to mobilize capital even within Africa. The scale might be different, but there is a mechanism through which it can be organized and made available to scale up some certain investments that are people-centered, that are controlled by local communities. And when I say local communities, I mean Kenyans and other nationalities of this continent. And that these resources then increase the investments, first and foremost, and also more fundamentally, increase the stake of Africa in terms of these investments, the rich, and we are able to reach those who do not even have energy. I think that is the missing link in terms of looking at then how do you make services such as energy, productive resources such as energy accessible to all in a manner that also increases stakeholding and incomes to the local community. And unless we are able to conceive policies in such a manner, then we will keep missing the opportunities that are there. I know in northern countries, in developed countries, they are still subsidizing a lot of their producers, their farmers, and pursuing models of production that are not sustainable. But within the African context, then you will see the government has not been able to dissect and analyze the landscape in a manner that even enables them bring producers, the local producers, in a substantive manner to contribute to building resilient systems, looking at what are they missing within their production system, and how do you really plug in to help them build resilience. Because when you look at climate change within the context of Africa, the interface that are quite apparent are like three: water, energy, food security. You can actually see those intersects featuring quite predominantly. The program and the measures that are being put and how they connect with the aspirations of this community then become an imperative. Thanks.
All right. I just want us to sample a few tweets, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Murobenzi, just to look at also what some of our viewers are sharing with us at Citizen TV Kenya. This is what you're saying. on social media. We invited you to be part and parcel of this very important conversation that we're having in studio this morning. And we have Bob Otieno Owino there saying we are heading to the right direction as UAE and the US pledged for $7.5 billion and 30 million respectively for climate change mitigation efforts. And of course, thank you for that, Bob. We have Engineer Lazaro saying youths should be fully engaged in all aspects. They should be, sorry, they should be among top decision makers in high-level summits like this one. The future belongs to them. Thank you for that. We have Kate Katebeske, you say, the so-called developed countries have duped African countries for long, yet they kept being the biggest contributors of climate change. It is time someone owned up and did a deserving compensation to mitigate the problem. All right, and we have one more. Sir Nixon, you say going green is not an easy thing, especially from the ground where a common man is. There's a total lack of empowerment. For instance, there are few EVs, like the President Ruto's yellow one, electric cookers, etc., really affordable. So electric vehicles, there are very few, he says. And we have Amaganga Mustafa, you say, the Green Climate Fund and other funds towards combating climate change crisis should be structured down to the villages to help in creating awareness. Let it not disappear on our clouds around Nairobi. All right, we have Godi Barasa Were saying the remaining piece in the puzzle of climate change mitigation is the correct and timely climate financing. This will ensure that as a continent, we achieve our objectives in good time and effectively. Thank you for that, Godi. And of course, that is what you've shared. We just want to look at the issue now of climate financing and how do we make it, work for the local communities. I'll come to you, Dr. Murobenzi, just to tell us a bit about the strategy that we have adopted as a continent. There's still a concern that the people who need this money most don't see it. What usually happens in the middle? What is it that we need to do as a change of strategy to ensure that we put money where it needs to be put and begin to feel the impact within the communities?
Yes, this is a very critical concern. The first thing is that there is, in fact, very little climate finance available for various reasons. And one of the focus of the climate summit is actually how can different forms of finance be leveraged in ways that will enable that finance to be available at all levels. For an example, Africa is in this serious debt crisis where most African countries are paying for just in interest on existing debt alone. African countries are paying around 50% more for servicing their debt, their external debt, than they're investing in education. I think about 30% more than they're investing in health. And so this burden has to be resolved first before finance can actually be leveraged. There are discussions that are happening now about how finance can be more affordable, including mechanisms for de-risking. One of the reasons why finance is so expensive in Africa is African governments borrow a 10, 15, 20% interest rate because of the perceived risk of lending to Africa. European, North American, Western governments are borrowing at maybe 3-4%, 10 times lower than Africa is actually doing. One of the things that this summit is doing is trying to see whether mechanisms can be put in place to de-risk lending to Africa. But secondly, also, in addition to accessing finance as loans, there are also conversations about how finance can be contagious so that we get financing in the form of grants and investments. When that happens, and of course, in addition to this, there are conversations about how you can leverage finance from the global financial institutions that have been created to provide climate finance, such as the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and so on. They have funds, but accessing those funds is very inefficient and very difficult. If we are able to leverage all of these forms of finance, then it does become possible to create space, fiscal space for governments to put in place appropriate solutions, financial solutions, project solutions, and so on, to address climate issues, and also to assist communities, local governments, and other actors to develop and resource their climate action. So first and foremost, I think the biggest issue is how do we make that finance available or accessible, and then we can use that newly accessed finance to support the development and implementation of appropriate climate solutions. That's just one side of the equation, right? The other equation is, and you have kept asking this question of capacity. What kind of capacity constraints do we experience, for instance, in designing solutions, and how can those be addressed? And one of the main challenges that we face on the continent is, of course, developing program and project interventions that are ready for investment. And I think the continent needs to invest in building those capacities to ensure that we do, in fact, compete at a global scale in designing appropriate interventions, appropriate projects that can attract investment. This is a very, very important consideration. Thank you.
All right, you've talked about, the debt burden, something that even our head of state yesterday talked about very passionately. And Philip, just to rope you in, yesterday, Oxfam gave a report just to indicate the climate change in terms of numbers. And I'm looking at what is needed for example, East Africa alone to be able to address the issue of climate change. That is about 7.9 billion shillings. But they say that the amount that African nations like Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, and South Sudan got from the rich nations in terms of climate-related development finance in 2021 is only $2.4 billion US. That's 349.8 billion. And this is something that they break down that out of this 349 billion, only 193 were given as grants. The rest were loans. So you know what that means. I mean, is this burden getting lighter or it's getting heavier for us as a continent?
It is getting heavier. So that's where I'll start by saying the burden is actually getting heavier. It's going to get much more heavier if African countries and the leaders within African countries are unable to recalibrate the discussion and recalibrate the discussion in a manner that goes back to the imperatives and the tenets of the Paris Agreement and exert a continental push for the northern countries to honor their commitment. I don't like speaking about those figures. The figures are good and they are good baseline, and it's good Oxfam and other actors have actually done that bit of study, and it's well appreciated because it forms the basis of pushing our discourse of engagement. But the extent to which they could be precise is neither here nor there, because again there are potentials for serious underestimates, particularly when you look at the crisis within the African region, and when you look at the resources and the amount of funding that are needed.
So it could be worse. That is what you're suggesting.
That is basically what I'm saying. It could be worse when we look at the amount of investment that is actually needed. And therefore, those figures just provide us with a platform within which we can begin to hold, first and foremost, conversations with ourselves, and also externalize the conversation with other actors with a view to assessing where the funding will come from. But there are some certain imperatives that again connect to the funding, which we must also mention. If you look at the pledges that were being put on table, is largely on mitigation. It's not even responding to the aspirations of Africa continent in terms of adaptation. But again, within the response, it is apparent that those who are funding are unable to see the core benefits that accrue from adaptation investment, right from the mitigation part of it, and also in terms of addressing potential or inherently losses and damages that are likely to occur. So the right type of funding, as Dr. Morobes has said, has to be a mix. But public and grant-based mechanism will and ought to constitute the larger part. Now the ACT is the other way around, which means essentially we are either sinking into more debt or even auctioning Africa economies to external players. That is what is essentially meaning. So we are increasing losing grip of our African economies through this particular funding model, and we are equally sinking into debt, which ought not to be. But let's also do an introspection even when we talk about this, because developed countries are pledged or have been able to put resources which ought to be in a general sense grant-based under the Green Climate Fund, the GCF. But what we are also seeing is GCF morphing to something else. Access to funding that is actually in GCF is much more other than accessing funding from World Bank. That is quite telling in terms of then what is the preferred model. Essentially, it means developed countries are saying, yes, we will still do a bit of our part to make funding available in grant form. We'll put it under GCF, but we'll make it too stringent and too difficult for you.
So the money is there, but accessing it now
becomes quite a challenge. But then they are also crafting another scheme where they are actually leveraging private sector's investment, meaning that the money that has actually gone in grant form is also now back available to private sector investors, largely from the global north, to again invest in programs.
Okay.
It's a conundrum of many things.
Okay, having painted that picture, because I'm left with very few minutes to wind up this conversation, what should be the take-homes? Because I want to appreciate the fact that it's not all doom and gloom. There are certain things, certain milestones, and certain things that we ought to be celebrating in how we've gone about this. But as we wind up, let me start with you, Dr. Murobenzi. As your final remarks, what should be the take-homes as we conclude this summit and this week? What is it that you feel should be the focus for Africa?
We need to move very quickly to ensure that the global financial architecture is reformed in ways that will not increase debt burden, as Philip has just said. But we also need to ensure that we create an environment which supports rapid industrialization of the continent to enable us to close the development gap that we face. Because adaptation and resilience to climate change is actually based on the level of development. But we also need to ensure that climate change does not reduce our capacity to achieve any of the sustainable development goals. So there is a direct link, for instance, between between emissions and GDP. Those nations that have got a high GDP also have high rates of emissions, and they need to take responsibility for the impacts that are already occurring. In other words, we also need to ensure that Africa's conditions and circumstances become central to the structure of the global climate discourse and narrative. If we do that, then perhaps we can actually have a very good possibility of ensuring that we don't continue interfering with the global climate system. That would be my biggest expectation from this summit. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that. Now, Joyce, on to you as well. What do you think should be the biggest take-home? And today is actually the day that we are expecting the Nairobi Declaration. What would be your expectation?
I loved the Monday speech when the president said, "Welcome to the future," as he was closing, and really us shifting our mindset and seeing what needs to be done moving forward, as starting today, things will be different. So that new development vision that this summit was working to deliver on, I feel like we have already delivered on it, even as now we wait for the declaration. So that's very energizing and very refreshing, that we're talking investments, we're talking partnerships, and not, no, we're victims. And really also appreciating how we've just also been disadvantaged by climate change, and saying, because of that, we're really going to be serious about the solutions. And really then also thinking of how we can raise our own resources for climate solutions. So that has been one incredible thing out of this summit. And we have our young people, they're the future. Population is going to double by 2050. We need to feed them, we need energy for these people, and we have the assets and the resources to realize this green growth future. And it's good to see how that unfolds later today when the presidents present the declaration.
All right, Philip, your thoughts as well? Seize the moment. That's what Africa is being requested to do. But how do we do that? What will be the benchmark for us as a continent to say we have actually seized the moment and taken advantage of it?
I think if we are able to send adaptation within the conversation, then we'll be making quite a real progress in this particular summit. And if we are going to come up with a declaration that does not again negate on Africa's gains within the UNFCCC, that will also be quite a significant progress in this particular case. But more importantly, and drawing from the voices that I heard yesterday from the national conference, if this conference is also going to construe mechanisms through which funding are able to flow at speed and scale to communities at the front line, strengthen their resilience and their economies, then the conference would have done justice.
All right, thank you so much for that. Philip Kilonzo is the head of policy, advocacy and communication at the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. I was also having a sit down in studio with Joyce Kabui, Africa Manager, Green Hydrogen Organization, and also joining us virtually on this conversation, Dr. James Murobenzi, Chief of Section, African Climate Policy Center of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Thank you, gentlemen and lady, for creating time for us this morning. And of course, a lot is to be expected today. The Nairobi Declaration, which President William Ruto says is going to be candid, bold, and practical for us to carry that conversation into the UN General Assembly and into the COP28. In simple terms, he says the journey has just started. My name is Safin Achieng Oma. Thank you for that part. Of course, I'll be coming with the next segment. Remember, on the 10th of September, we are marking the World Suicide Prevention Day, and we want to talk about where we are at as a country in terms of suicide prevention. So that conversation coming up shortly. Do stay with us.